Rain fell softly over the glass towers of Chicago that autumn morning, thin and cold, the kind of rain that clings to a coat collar and never quite announces itself as a storm. Inside the lobby of Asterion Dynamics, a man in a suit that had been altered more than once stood quietly near the window, watching the water streak sideways down the glass. He noticed a young woman standing alone across the room, holding a folder against her chest, her eyes fixed on the elevator doors as though she were counting the seconds until they opened. He offered her a polite smile, the kind a stranger gives another stranger who looks just as nervous as he feels, and stepped a little closer. "Excuse me," he said gently. "Are you here for the interview too?" She nodded, and something in her guarded expression eased, just slightly, just enough. For nearly 40 minutes they talked, low voices under the hum of the air conditioning, and he found himself doing most of the reassuring. He told her not to worry about the panel inside, that most interviewers only wanted to see how a person thought under pressure, not how polished their answers sounded on paper. She listened closely, asked quiet, careful questions, and thanked him more than once, her posture slowly loosening the longer they spoke. When the clock on the wall struck 9, doors opened at the end of the hall, and the entire leadership team rose to their feet in a single unified motion. Chairs scraping back, heads turning toward the entrance. The woman he had just been comforting walked past all of them without hesitation and took the seat at the head of the table. "Let's begin the interview," she said, and then, turning to him with the faintest smile, added, "Thank you for interviewing me first." The room went completely silent, and every head in it slowly turned to look at the man still standing near the window. Elias Rowan was 39 years old, and by every visible measure, he did not belong in that lobby. His shoes were clean but worn at the heel, resoled once already. His shirt pressed by his own hand that morning on an ironing board that folded out from behind his kitchen door. His leather briefcase had gone soft with age and cracked along one seam, the handle wrapped once in electrical tape years earlier and never replaced. He had taken the train to get there, standing the whole way because the seats were full, watching the city blur past the window while he silently rehearsed answers to questions he was not even sure anyone would think to ask him. He had once co-founded an artificial intelligence startup, back when he still believed the future belonged to people who built things instead of people who protected titles. But a family tragedy years earlier had pulled him out of that world entirely, quietly, without ceremony, the way a tide pulls sand from beneath a person's feet without their noticing until they are already standing somewhere new. Since then, he had lived simply, worked as an independent consultant, taking whatever contracts came his way, and asked for very little from anyone, least of all sympathy. When he stepped through the revolving doors of Asterion Dynamics, the receptionist glanced at his briefcase and, without thinking twice, asked if he was there to fix the printers on the 4th floor. He corrected her calmly, gave his name, spelled it once when she looked unsure, and took a seat in the waiting area among candidates dressed in suits that likely cost more than his monthly rent combined with his groceries. A few of them looked him over the way people look at something out of place in a museum. Not cruel exactly, just dismissive, the kind of glance that files a person away before they have said a single word worth remembering. One young man in a charcoal suit leaned toward his neighbor and murmured something Elias could not quite hear, though the laughter that followed told him enough. Leon Briggs, seated across from him with his legs crossed and his watch angled just so toward the light, leaned forward with a smirk stretched wide across his face. "You sure you've got the right address, old-timer?" he asked, loud enough for the entire row to hear, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own place in a room. Elias only smiled. He did not straighten his jacket or explain himself, or offer some clever retort designed to win the room back to his side. He simply let the comment pass through him like wind through an open door, folding his hands over the folder in his lap, and returning his attention to the notes he had written the night before at his kitchen table. Something about that stillness made the laughter around him fade faster than Leon expected, and one or two candidates who had been smirking moments earlier suddenly found something interesting to study on their phones instead, unwilling to meet the quiet dignity sitting so plainly across from them. Even Leon seemed briefly unsettled by the lack of reaction, glancing around as though searching for someone to confirm that his joke had landed the way he intended. And finding no one willing to laugh a second time, it was in that small, unspoken victory of restraint over provocation, that the doors opened again, and a young woman walked in wearing a plain gray coat with no name tag, no lanyard, nothing at all to announce who she was or why she had come. Elias had spent the previous evening the same way he spent most evenings, alone in a small apartment on the north side of the city, reheating a simple dinner and reading through everything he could find about Asterian dynamics until well past midnight. He had no family waiting up for him, no photographs on the refrigerator of children he needed to rush home to, only a quiet apartment that had grown used to holding one person instead of two. He had built a life out of routine since his wife's passing, small disciplines that kept the days from feeling too empty, an early walk, a strong cup of coffee, a folder of notes prepared the night before any meeting that mattered. That morning, he had chosen his best suit, the navy one he had bought years earlier for a very different kind of interview, and had pressed it carefully, even though he suspected, deep down, that it would still look plain beside whatever the other candidates wore. She scanned the room the way someone scans a place they already know too well, searching not for an open seat, but for something else entirely. Something harder to name. Her eyes eventually settled on Elias, the only person in the room who had not looked up when she entered, still absorbed in his notes, unaware of being watched. He noticed her a moment later, assumed, reasonably enough, that she was simply another candidate trying to look composed, while her stomach twisted with the same nerves he had spent the entire train ride trying to steady. He shifted his worn briefcase off the empty seat beside him to make room, the way he might have offered a seat to anyone standing awkwardly in a crowded space, expecting nothing in return. He had no way of knowing that this small, ordinary act of moving a bag 6 inches to the left would, within the hour, quietly rearrange the entire direction of his life. Vivian Cross took the seat beside him and thanked him quietly, her voice steady but careful, as though she were testing the sound of her own words in a room she did not fully trust. Elias introduced himself first, the way he always did, extending a hand and a name before asking for anything in return, a habit older than the company he now sat outside of. She shook his hand and gave only her first name in return, watching his face a beat longer than the exchange alone would explain, as if reading something written just beneath his skin. He asked what drew her to a company like Asterian, and she turned the question back on him almost immediately, asking the same thing in reverse, her tone light but her attention sharp and unwavering. He answered honestly, without polish, the way he answered most things, and something in that honesty seemed to catch her off guard. He told her the truth, that he had once built something meaningful in this industry and lost his footing after his wife passed away, leaving him to raise a household and rebuild a life almost entirely on his own. He explained that he was here now not chasing a title or a salary line, but chasing meaning, a reason to get up in the morning and do work that felt like it mattered again, instead of simply filling the hours. She asked, quietly, what kind of leader he thought made a company worth working for. And he answered, without hesitation, the words rising from somewhere older and steadier than the interview room down the hall. If I were the one hiring, he said, the first thing I'd change is who gets chosen. I'd take a kind person over a brilliant one every single time, because brilliance without character just builds faster ways to hurt people. Vivian went quiet for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes, though her expression gave almost nothing away to a room that had not yet learned to read her. She pressed further, leaning slightly forward now, asking what he would do if a talented employee produced remarkable results but treated the people around them with contempt. He answered that talent was replaceable but trust was not, that a team built on fear might sprint for a season but would eventually collapse under the weight of its own resentment, quietly, from the inside, long before anyone outside noticed the cracks. She nodded slowly, jotting nothing down on the folder in her lap, seeming instead to memorize the answer, the way a person memorizes something they intend to return to later. For several more minutes, she asked him questions that felt less like small talk and more like a careful audit of his character, patient and unhurried, though she never once revealed why she wanted to know so much about a stranger she had just met in a waiting room. Elias, still entirely under the impression that they were simply two nervous strangers passing time before a shared ordeal, answered every question with the same unguarded honesty he might have offered an old friend over coffee. It was in the middle of one such answer, as he explained why loyalty mattered more to him than efficiency, that a man in a tailored navy suit approached the two of them quietly and inclined his head toward Vivian, a gesture so brief and so deliberately respectful that it barely registered as unusual to anyone not paying close attention. Miles Carter, the company's head of human resources, said nothing more than a soft "Miss Cross" before stepping back into the hallway to attend to something further down the corridor. Elias, absorbed in finishing his thought about leadership and the slow erosion of loyalty in modern companies, did not notice the small bow at all, did not register the title, did not think twice about the interruption. He simply continued talking, continued explaining, continued building the case for the kind of company he wished still existed somewhere in this industry, entirely unaware that the woman sitting across from him already ran the very company he was describing down to its last detail. At precisely 9 o'clock, the doors at the end of the hallway opened, and the atmosphere in the waiting area shifted instantly, the way a room changes the moment true authority enters it without needing to raise its voice. Every executive seated near the head of the long conference table rose at once, chairs scraping softly against the polished floor, heads inclining in a practiced, silent unison that spoke of years of rehearsal. Elias watched, confused, as Vivian stood from the bench beside him, smoothed the front of her plain gray coat with 2 quick motions, and walked toward that same table without a trace of the nervousness she had shown only minutes earlier. She took the seat at the head of the room, the one chair in the entire building reserved for exactly one person, and Elias felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him, the way it does in the instant before a person fully understands what has just happened. Leon Briggs let out a short, satisfied laugh from across the room, certain that Elias had just made the kind of mistake careers rarely recover from. "Guess the janitor made a friend," he muttered to the man beside him, loud enough to be heard by half the room, clearly expecting Elias to shrink under the weight of his own embarrassment. Vivian, however, turned toward Elias with a small, knowing smile that silenced the laughter faster and more completely than any rebuke could have managed. "I hope you still stand by what you told me a few minutes ago," she said, her voice carrying easily across the room without ever rising in volume, and the interview began in earnest, every eye now fixed on the man who had, without knowing it, already been tested and had already, without trying, begun to pass. She moved through the panel with practiced efficiency, addressing each candidate in turn with brief, pointed questions, but her attention kept circling back to Elias with a precision the others could not help but notice. When his file finally landed in front of her, she studied it for a long moment before looking up, her expression unreadable. "There's a 7-year gap in your work history," she said. Not unkindly, but directly, the kind of question meant to see how a person carries the parts of their story they would rather leave folded away. The room seemed to lean in collectively, waiting to see whether the man who had spoken so easily about kindness in the lobby could speak just as easily about loss in front of an audience. Elias did not flinch from the question, though something in his posture softened, the way a person's shoulders drop when they decide honesty is worth more than the armor of pride. He explained that he had built an artificial intelligence company from almost nothing, poured years of his life into it, and eventually sold his stake after his wife died and left him raising their household alone, with no partner to share the weight of ordinary days. He did not dress the story up with drama, did not ask for sympathy, did not list his accomplishments to soften the blow of his long absence from the industry he had once helped shape. "I just wanted to do work that meant something," he said simply, "and for a long time, that meant being present for my life instead of my resume." Leon could not resist the opening, leaning back in his chair with the same smirk he had worn since the lobby, apparently unable to let a silence pass without filling it. "Or maybe nobody wanted to hire you," he said, letting the words hang in the air like an accusation dressed up carelessly as a joke. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the kind that makes people study their hands rather than look at either man directly. And every executive at the table, seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see whether Elias would defend himself or simply absorb the blow. He did not raise his voice. He did not even glance in Leon's direction. He simply turned back to Vivian and answered the question she had actually asked him, leaving the insult to dissolve, unanswered and unclaimed, somewhere in the space between the two men. Vivian watched this exchange, with the quiet focus of someone recording every detail for later use, and something in Elias's refusal to take the bait seemed to confirm a suspicion she had been carrying since the moment they first sat down together in the lobby. She reached beneath the folder in front of her and pulled out a second document, older, slightly yellowed at the edges, the kind of file that had clearly been retrieved from storage rather than printed fresh that morning. She slid it toward the center of the table without a word, and Elias's own name, printed in a font from a decade earlier, stared back up at him from the page, like a message sent forward through time. The room grew quiet again, but differently this time, curiosity replacing judgment as Vivian began to speak. 10 years earlier, she explained, a small, struggling technology firm on the brink of collapse had been saved by an unexpected partnership, one that provided both emergency funding and a critical piece of software architecture at exactly the moment it was needed most, in the final weeks before the company would have folded entirely. That firm, she said, watching Elias's face carefully as the words landed, was the company that would eventually grow, restructure, rebrand, and become Asterion Dynamics itself, the very tower they were all sitting inside at that moment. No one in the room, not Miles, not Nora, not even the executives who had worked there for over a decade, had ever heard this particular piece of the company's founding history before. Elias sat back slightly, genuinely surprised, and admitted with a quiet shrug that he had honestly forgotten the deal had ever happened, that it had been one of dozens of small partnerships his old company brokered in a single frantic year of survival, back when every week felt like it might be the last one. He had not thought about it in years, had certainly never connected it to the glass tower he now sat inside. And there was no performance in his surprise, no calculated modesty, designed to impress a room full of executives. Vivian studied him for a long moment, longer than the silence comfortably allowed, as though she were trying to determine whether a man could truly forget the very thing that had, in some quiet and unacknowledged way, built the room he was now sitting in. Nora Sinclair, seated near the far end of the table, exchanged a startled glance with Miles, both of them visibly recalculating everything they thought they had understood about the ordinary man in the altered suit. "Why have you never told anyone this?" Vivian finally asked, her voice quieter now, almost private despite the crowded room around them still listening closely. It was not a challenge this time, but something closer to genuine curiosity. The question of someone who had spent years surrounded by people eager to claim credit for accomplishments far smaller than this one. Elias considered the question honestly before answering, admitting that he had never seen the point in bringing up old victories when the present always seemed to ask for something else entirely, something new, something forward-facing. He had not built anything to be remembered for it, he said. He had built things because they needed building, and once his part was finished, he simply moved on to whatever needed him next, without ceremony or announcement. Vivian let the silence stretch a moment longer before setting the old file aside and shifting the entire tone of the room with a single, deliberate sentence, announcing that the panel would now move into a scenario exercise for all remaining candidates. She described a crisis, one drawn directly from the company's own recent history, though she did not say so outright, in which a major artificial intelligence project had begun failing catastrophically just months before its planned launch, threatening thousands of jobs and years of invested capital across 3 different departments. The other candidates leaned forward instinctively, sensing an opportunity to perform in front of the woman who now clearly controlled every outcome in the room, while Leon immediately proposed the solution he seemed certain would win the day, a sweeping and rapid reduction in staff to cut costs and salvage the budget before the failure spread any further. Elias disagreed immediately and calmly, without raising his voice or dismissing Leon's point, outright the way Leon had so often dismissed his own presence in the room. He began laying out an alternative path, arguing that the failure likely lived in the process itself rather than in the people executing it, that panic-driven layoffs would strip away the very institutional knowledge needed to actually diagnose and fix the problem at its root. He proposed instead a careful, methodical approach, correcting the flawed workflow first, retraining the existing team around the corrected process, and preserving the accumulated experience that no new hire could replace in time to matter. Vivian pressed him with question after question, testing every seam in his logic, asking what he would do if the board demanded immediate visible cuts within the week, asking how he would justify the delay to investors who wanted measurable results by the following quarter. He answered each challenge without losing his composure, building his case piece by careful piece the way a man lays bricks he has laid 1,000 times before in a different life. And by the time he finished, even Nora had stopped taking notes entirely and simply listened, arms folded, clearly reconsidering every assumption she had walked into the room with that morning. Two other candidates attempted to split the difference between Elias and Leon, offering vague, cautious answers designed to avoid offending anyone at the table rather than to actually solve the crisis Vivian had described. One suggested a partial reduction paired with a public relations campaign to soften the announcement, while the other proposed delaying the decision entirely until further data could be gathered, a suggestion Vivian dismissed within seconds as the kind of thinking that had already cost the company 3 failed teams. Elias listened to each answer politely, without interrupting, and when Vivian turned back to him for a final response, he simply added that any solution which prioritized optics over people would eventually fail twice, once when it was implemented, and again when it had to be undone. Nora, watching closely, asked him directly whether he was certain the workforce could be retrained quickly enough to matter. And he answered that certainty was never guaranteed in a turnaround, only that the alternative guaranteed failure far more reliably. Vivian closed the folder in front of her and rose from her seat, and the room straightened instinctively at the movement. Sensing that something decisive was about to happen after nearly 2 hours of careful observation, "I'd like to speak with Mr. Rowan privately," she said, her tone giving away nothing to the room at large, and the other candidates exchanged uneasy glances as Elias stood and followed her toward a door at the far end of the room that none of them had noticed until that exact moment, tucked quietly beside a bookshelf no one had thought to look at twice. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence carrying more weight than anything said aloud in the crowded room outside. Vivian finally admitted what Elias had already begun to suspect on some level, that the morning encounter in the lobby had never been an accident, that she regularly disguised herself as a candidate before major hiring decisions in order to see, without pretense or performance, how people treated someone who appeared to hold no power at all. Most candidates, she explained, barely acknowledged her, offering polite but hollow greetings before turning their full attention toward whoever in the room looked important enough to be worth impressing. Elias had done neither. He had simply seen a nervous stranger and offered her a seat and a kind word, never once suspecting there was anything at all to gain from the gesture, expecting nothing, calculating nothing. "That's the reason you're still sitting in that room," she said quietly, and something in her voice suggested this was not flattery but plain fact, a conclusion she had reached through years of watching people reveal themselves in unguarded, unwatched moments. She reached into the pocket of her coat and withdrew a small silver flash drive, turning it over once in her fingers before holding it out to him across the narrow space between them. "Before I tell you what I'm offering," she said, "I want to see what you do with this first." He took it without asking a single question. The way a person accepts a task they already sense matters more than the words used to describe it. Elias asked her, carefully, why a woman who ran one of the most valuable companies in the country would still feel the need to sit in a cold lobby pretending to be someone she was not. Vivian considered the question for a long moment before answering, admitting that titles had a way of changing how people spoke to her, softening their honesty, sharpening their flattery, until she could no longer trust a single word said in her presence. She had learned, she said, that the only way to see a person clearly was to remove every reason they might have to perform for her. And the only way to do that was to become, for one morning at a time, someone with nothing to offer them at all. It was a lonely way to run a company, she admitted. But it was the only way she had found that still worked. And Elias found himself understanding that particular loneliness more than he expected to. Inside the drive was a project that had quietly haunted Asterion Dynamics for years, an initiative so troubled that 3 separate teams had already failed to salvage it and buried the files rather than admit defeat publicly to a board that expected only success. Elias reviewed the data for only a few minutes before something clicked into place behind his eyes, a pattern the previous teams had apparently missed entirely in their rush to blame the technology instead of the thinking behind it. The failure, he explained, was never rooted in the code or the architecture at all, but in a flawed strategic assumption made at the very start of the project, one that had quietly poisoned every decision built on top of it for years afterward, without anyone tracing it back far enough. He stepped to a whiteboard, mounted on the wall of the small office, and began sketching out his reasoning in quick, confident strokes, walking Vivian through the logic, the way he might have once walked his own small team through a similar crisis in a very different life. When they returned to the main conference room, and the other executives were called back in from the hallway, Elias presented his findings aloud, and the reaction was immediate, executives leaning forward, voices rising in overlapping debate, as old assumptions were suddenly and publicly called into question for the first time in years. Nora Sinclair, who had spent the entire morning treating candidates who seemed too ordinary with visible suspicion, found herself nodding along with his conclusions, almost against her own instincts, and for the first time all day, she spoke in open agreement rather than pointed skepticism. Miles Carter quietly made a note in the margin of his own folder, something he would later admit he rarely bothered doing during interviews, that had already, in his mind, concluded. Vivian let the debate run its course for several more minutes before rising once again, and the room quieted instantly. Every gaze turning toward her the way a compass turns, without effort, toward its fixed point. The interview, she announced, is over. Leon straightened in his chair, a satisfied smile already forming across his face, certain that his earlier confidence and his sharper suit had carried the day in a room full of people who valued exactly those things. Vivian's gaze, however, moved past him entirely and settled squarely on Elias. "I'd like to offer you a position," she said, and Leon's smile faltered slightly at the phrasing, sensing before the sentence even finished that something was about to go badly for him. The role Vivian named was not the one that had been publicly posted, not some mid-level management position buried 3 floors beneath the executive suite, but Chief Strategy Officer, a seat that reported directly to her own office and answered to no one else in the building. The room fell into stunned silence, the kind that makes furniture creak and breathing seem too loud in the sudden absence of conversation, and Leon rose halfway from his chair to object before catching himself under the weight of Vivian's steady, unbothered stare. "With respect," he began, his voice tighter than before. "I have twice the industry experience this man has. I've closed deals worth more than his entire old company." He looked around the table for support, expecting at least one of the executives to back him, but found only careful, unreadable expressions staring back. None of them willing to defend a position Vivian had already so clearly closed. Miles Carter, who had said very little throughout the entire morning, finally spoke, quietly noting that experience closing deals and experience earning trust had never been measured on the same scale, no matter how often companies confused the two. Leon opened his mouth to respond again, then thought better of it, sitting back slowly into his chair as the full weight of the room's silence settled over him. Vivian did not raise her voice or offer further justification to the room at large. She simply looked at him and said, "I don't hire people who make impressions. I hire people who create value." And something about the flatness of her delivery made the statement impossible to argue with any further. But even as the room absorbed the shock of her decision, it was clear from the careful way Vivian folded her hands on the table that there was still something more she had not yet told them. Vivian waited until the room had mostly settled before she spoke again. And this time her voice carried a different weight, something closer to confession than announcement. She explained that the building's security systems upgraded the previous year with an artificial intelligence monitoring platform, had quietly recorded every movement in the lobby that morning, long before either of them had exchanged a single word with each other. The footage showed Elias pausing to help a security guard gather a scattered stack of dropped folders, holding the door open without being asked for a cleaning worker, pushing a heavy cart toward the service elevator, thanking the receptionist by name, though he had only just met her moments before, and offering comfort to a stranger without a single clue as to who she really was or what she could offer him in return. "I didn't choose you because you once saved this company a decade ago," Vivian said, her eyes steady on his across the length of the table. "I chose you because after everything you built and everything you lost, kindness was still the first thing you reached for, without an audience, and without any reason at all to expect something back for it." Elias said nothing for a long moment, the weight of the last hour settling over him all at once. The lobby, the old file, the flash drive, the offer, and now this final, quiet revelation. When he finally accepted the position, it was not the title that moved him, nor the return to an industry he had once walked away from without regret, but the quiet, almost startling realization that somewhere in this glass tower, a place had finally asked what kind of person he was before it ever asked what he could produce for it. News of the decision moved through the building faster than any memo ever could, and by the following week, most of Asterion Dynamics had heard some version of the story, though few knew the full truth of that rainy morning in the lobby. Elias arrived early on his first official day, dressed in the same altered suit he had worn to the interview, and found his new office already stocked with the files from the troubled project he had diagnosed weeks earlier, a clear signal from Vivian that the real work would begin immediately and without ceremony. He spent his first month rebuilding the failing initiative from the ground up, meeting personally with engineers who had spent years quietly convinced their work was doomed, listening far more than he spoke, and slowly earning a kind of trust that no title alone could have purchased. The project that had once haunted 3 separate teams and cost the company untold months of wasted effort became, within a single quarter, the first visible success story of his tenure, celebrated not with fanfare, but with the quiet satisfaction of people who had finally been heard. Vivian, for her part, used the momentum of that success to quietly rewrite the company's entire hiring process from top to bottom, folding character assessments and simple, unguarded tests of empathy into every stage of recruitment across every department. She insisted, over the objections of a few longtime executives who preferred the old metrics, that no resume, however polished, could ever measure what truly mattered most in a person joining the company. Miles Carter, who had spent years running interviews built almost entirely around credentials and pedigree, found himself redesigning his own process around simple, human moments. A dropped folder, an unattended door, a stranger who needed nothing but a moment of attention. Nora Sinclair, once quick to distrust anyone who seemed too ordinary to matter, became one of the loudest advocates for the new approach after watching it succeed firsthand in front of her own eyes. Leon Briggs stayed only a few more months after the interview, his confidence never fully recovering from that single afternoon in the conference room, and he eventually resigned to pursue a role at a competing firm that still measured people the old way. Before he left, he stopped by Elias's office once, uninvited, and stood in the doorway for a long moment before finally admitting, in his own clipped and reluctant way, that he had misjudged the man in the altered suit from the very first morning. Elias simply nodded, offered his hand the way he always did, and wished him well without a trace of resentment or quiet triumph in his voice, the same steady grace he had carried through every insult that rainy morning months before. Leon left the building that afternoon a little quieter than he had entered it, though whether the lesson stayed with him beyond the elevator doors, no one in the office could say for certain. By the following year, the story of that rainy morning had become something close to legend within the walls of Asterion Dynamics, told and retold by new hires during their first week, though the details shifted slightly with each telling the way stories always do. New employees were taught, gently but unmistakably, that the person sweeping the lobby floor and the person about to sign the largest contract in company history deserved exactly the same courtesy because no one could ever be entirely certain which was which. Vivian rarely spoke about the incident herself, preferring to let the culture speak for itself rather than repeating her own legend, but she made certain the principle behind it survived in every policy she signed and every review she approved. Elias, for his part, remained just as unassuming in his new role as he had been in the lobby that first morning, still taking the train some days, still carrying the same briefcase long after the company offered to replace it. Because some things, he said, were worth keeping exactly as they were. Between Elias and Vivian, something quieter than romance but no less significant began to take root in the months that followed, built not on stolen glances or dramatic gestures but on the steady, accumulating evidence of two people who had each, in their own separate ways, learned exactly what it cost to lose sight of what truly mattered. They worked closely together through long strategy sessions, and even longer evenings, when the rest of the building had gone dark, trading ideas across cluttered tables, each one slowly discovering in the other a kind of honesty rare enough to be worth protecting carefully rather than rushing toward. Vivian found herself, more than once, staying later than necessary simply to hear how Elias would untangle a problem the rest of the team had already given up on, and Elias found himself looking forward to those late evenings more than he was willing to admit even to himself. Neither of them rushed to name what was quietly growing between them, content instead to let it develop the way anything worth keeping usually does, slowly, carefully, without force, without an audience, and without the need for anyone else's approval. On a quiet afternoon many weeks later, as the last of the autumn rain finally gave way to the first clear light of winter settling over the city, Vivian walked Elias to the elevator after a long strategy meeting, and neither of them spoke right away, content simply to walk side by side in the comfortable silence they had built together over the months. She extended her hand the way she had that first morning in the lobby, a small echo of the gesture that had started everything, and he took it, and for a moment they simply stood there together, two people who had once mistaken each other for strangers and had somehow found, underneath all of it, something worth trusting completely. She smiled, the kind of smile she rarely allowed herself inside that building full of watching eyes, and told him she was glad he had moved his bag that morning to make room for her. He smiled back, quiet and certain, and told her he was glad she had let him, and somewhere behind them, through the tall glass windows of the lobby where it had all begun, the last of the rain finally stopped. Neither of them said much more that afternoon, and neither of them needed to, because the truest parts of the story had already been spoken months earlier in a crowded waiting room, long before titles or offices or names had entered the conversation at all. What had started as a small, ordinary kindness, offered without expectation, had, in time, reshaped an entire company from the inside out. One quiet decision after another. And somewhere in that glass tower, long after the elevator doors closed behind them, the lesson remained simple enough for anyone to understand. That character revealed in the smallest, most unwatched moments was worth more than any title a person could ever earn. And that sincerity, however long it waited, was always eventually recognized.